One of the most exciting aspects of writing and even reading fiction is the world in which the characters live. Is it a version of Earth in a far-flung future where humanity has been at war for more than 2 decades against an alien hegemony, and only an enhanced super soldier is our only hope? Is it a world filled with anthropomorphic bears capable of turning into bouncy balls the moment they take a sip of their juice box? Or is it a world in which the Muppets have finally taken Manhattan? We're going to be looking at how to take familiar elements and transform them into an imaginative and extraordinary new experience. I'm your host, Garrett K. Jones, and we are continuing our Season 5 deep dive into exploring elements of world building. Welcome back to The Right Way. We have a great episode in store for you with this week's content, but before we jump into this month's writing tip, there are a couple of announcements. Now, if you're local to the Hanford area, I will be at the Hanford Library today from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. for a local author event. If you haven't picked up copies of my books, The Archives of Issink Ran, or if you'd like to just come by and see me for the first time in a while, I would love to see you guys. We also have 10 weeks remaining until Author Awareness April. Now, I've intentionally moved the interview marathon 4 months up from August to give me a little bit more time to recover from the end of the season. I have 4 great authors that I'll be interviewing, which I will be featuring them in a fantastic showcase on Saturday, April the 1st. Lastly, we are exactly 8 weeks away from the 200th milestone episode. For that episode, I'll be doing a special author awareness interview, and like always, I will be interviewing a very special guest. It's going to be super fun, and I'm really excited to share that episode with my viewers. So make sure to tune in for that episode. World building is one of the most crucial aspects of writing. We are going to continue looking at Ellen Brock's world building Bible templates and applying it through the lens of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Last month, we examined what the Avatar's world looks like by exploring medicine, professions, and economy. This month, we are tackling 2 more categories from the 21 that Brock listed. Today, we are covering history and clothing. So let's dive in, shall we? The world of Avatar: The Last Airbender is heavily steeped in history, with events and important figures dotted throughout the series' narrative. According to Ellen Brock's world-building Bible, there are 6 bullet points to focus on when developing the history of the world you're building. Let's take a look at each one and see how they apply in Avatar and what we can learn to apply to our own writing. Our bullet points are major world events, major wars, major natural disasters, the age of civilization, previous leaders and rulers, and recent cultural shifts and changes. The world of Avatar is actually in the simultaneous midst of a major world event and a major war. The best way to look at history is to look at it as a tapestry with threads connecting one event to the next, creating a chain or sequence. Essentially, it's a great representation of physics and the philosophical concept of causality. It's a domino effect, essentially. The Avatar series takes place during an entire world war that kicked off a century before the first episode. And if we backtrack, we can actually see why it happened in the first place. The question we need to ask is, why? Well, to put it bluntly, it's the Avatar's fault. What? Hold on. Hear me out. Okay, I'm not blaming Avatar Aang, I'm blaming him and Avatar Roku, who came before him. I'm not finished. Like I said, history is about causality. Let's work our way backwards to help us better look at this bit of causality. The war raged for so long because the Avatar wasn't there to stop the Fire Nation from almost literally steamrolling over the rest of the world. Aang ran away from his destiny, in part because he wasn't ready, and in part because he was too young to embrace the title, because he should have been told at age 16, not age 12. But had he not run away, he would have been slaughtered like all of his air nomad brethren when the Fire Nation committed genocide on the orders of then Fire Lord Sozin. That begs the question, why did Sozin want the airbenders dead? The reason has to do with the Avatar cycle. Air would have been the next element in the cycle after fire, which Avatar Roku was originally a firebender. This comes into play during a Season 3 episode entitled The Avatar and the Fire Lord, in which Aang and Zuko simultaneously learn about their shared past, as Aang's past life as Roku was Zuko's biological great-grandfather on his mother's side. Getting back to Sozin, however, the Fire Lord allowed Roku to die when the volcano under Roku's island erupted instead of saving his former best friend, and Aang was born the same day Roku died. Sozin was trying to forcibly break the Avatar cycle. Now we backtrack further. Why did Sozin and Roku's friendship come to an end? This occurred because then Avatar Roku confronted Sozin about the Fire Nation colonies that he was establishing in parts of the Earth Kingdom's coast. They were unwelcome and unsanctioned, and was starting to throw the world off balance. Now, instead of listening to the wise counsel of his friend, Sozin arrogantly defied the Avatar and tried to attack his former friend. Roku showed compassion instead of ending the fight decisively, and it forever marred their friendship. We get inklings of the Fire Lord's colonialist ideas during a sparring session between the two friends on the day Roku is informed of his status as the Avatar. Now we get another incident during Roku's wedding when Sozin tells him about the idea directly, as if he's trying to get permission because he is the Avatar's best friend. When you pull on that thread, you see the hows and the whys of the historical pattern building to give credence to what takes place in the story that you are writing. This can include major natural disasters. Our third bullet point, disasters can play a huge part in how history is affected. Case in point, Europe was marked by wars, inflation, and famines during what was called the General Crisis. Historians blame it on class and social hierarchies, but climatologists look at it scientifically as what is known as the Little Ice Age, where glaciers crept further south and colder than normal temperatures dramatically changed agriculture and business around Europe at the time. The stretch of the Thames running through London actually froze as a result in 1677. Now, Avatar uses major natural disasters as an element within the storytelling. The start of the 100 Years' War began when firebenders began using what became known as Sozin's Comet to enhance their firebending, and it was a massive volcanic eruption akin to Krakatoa in 1883 that killed Roku. So, here's writing tip number 1. Put together a timeline of events for your story so you can see exactly what causes and their effects have on the events and characters in your story. You can even factor in the age of the civilization as well. Even if this is a one-off standalone story set in modern day, it helps to know how things play out. Authors like Michael Crichton and Tom Clancy were particularly good at paying attention to the timeline of events precipitating the story of their books, especially since those were set in modern day and were techno thrillers and socio-political thrillers. But if you're writing something like science fiction or fantasy, look no further than Frank Herbert or J.R.R. Tolkien, who both wrote sweeping histories for their literary worlds. Just stay away from Amazon's Rings of Power unless you're totally up for a revisionist variant of Middle-earth. Ugh. Using the timeline as a jumping off point, that moves us into looking at past leaders and rulers. Avatar already gives us a great deal of history with this. No pun intended. The 3 seasons of Avatar actually give us a great characterization for 4 generations of Fire Lords. We have the always competitive and power-hungry Sozin. We are introduced to his callous son Azulon, as in The Gates of, who demands Zuko be sacrificed by his own father Ozai as recompense for his betrayal of firstborn Iroh. We get the scheming Ozai, who cruelly tortures and banishes his own son instead of being the loving father he should have been. And at the end, we get Zuko, who breaks the cycle of war and abuse. While we don't see past leaders of the Water Tribes or Earth Kingdom, we do get glances of the air nomad elders from Aang's memories. The funny thing is about leaders is that they have the ability to both influence and be influenced by the culture and its changes. From historical perspectives, take a look at 2 famous leaders, Emperor Constantine and Harold Bluetooth. Both men converted to Christianity. Constantine supposedly converted in 312 AD because of a dream of the Cairo and immediately prompted his soldiers to paint the emblem on their shields, which confused the opposing army to not fight, thinking that they were facing against fellow Christians. Constantine was not only the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, he was the first to draft protective laws in support of the Christian adherents, which was a polar opposite to his predecessor, Diocletian. King Harold Bluetooth was the king of Denmark and Norway during the 10th century AD. While Constantine formally introduced Christianity as the official Roman religion, Bluetooth introduced it to Denmark during his 28-year reign. Accounts of Bluetooth's conversion to Christianity differ substantially. One historian said he converted to Catholicism as part of a trade agreement with either Otto I or Otto II, whichever was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. The other account stated that Bluetooth was forcibly converted by Otto I, but the first account was written by someone who actually lived at the same time as Harold, and the second was written by someone almost a century after Harold died. Regardless, much of Europe had converted to Christianity by that point, and it became harder for the Vikings to do business and trade with other people groups unless they themselves converted to Christianity. Constantine's conversion was a political and military move, while Bluetooth's was more of a social economic move. So, here's writing tip number 2. Determine in advance how the leaders in your series both influence and are influenced by culture. It's not uncommon for politicians to vie for office or power because they feel mission-led to make cultural changes, while others continue to campaign by shifting their personal stance and values based on what is popular at the time. This past election cycle. Let's shift over to clothing, which is something that changes by culture and history over time. Brock's template offers us 8 bullet points. I'm actually only going into 5 bullet points. Fabrics by cost, styles by class, styles by diversity, and styles by region. Well, I guess it's just 4. I took a costuming class in college and learned that clothing and fashion often move in these weird cyclical patterns where styles and designs move in and out of popularity periodically. As it stands, clothing and styles worn today are vastly different than they were a century ago or even 2 centuries ago. In Avatar, we have some interesting clothing choices on display. In fact, every single bullet point in Brock's list is on example. While we don't see how much fabrics cost individually, we do see a distinct difference in style based on the different classes depicted in the show. These differences are less evident among the air nomads who don't actually have a class system, though there are accessories indicating the hierarchy of ranks among the teachers and the monks. There is a slight difference among the water tribes, but those differences only get depicted in the northern tribe because there are more people present and distinct social dynamics that aren't as evident among the southern tribe. Ironically enough, Princess Azula calls Katara a peasant, which is interesting given the fact that Katara's father is the chief of her tribe. The styles among social classes is seen more in the Fire Nation and especially the Earth Kingdom, more specifically as we get into their respective capitals of Azulon and Ba Sing Se. The more common you are, the less of a selection you have from the shops. Most of the fabrics are going to be bland in their colors, while resonating colors traditional of the region. And the lower class wears more muted colors, like the rust gray in the Fire Nation and the brown or tan color in the Earth Kingdom. The wealthier the character, the more opulent and the more vibrant the colors and the materials are going to be. In the real world, denim is a relatively inexpensive fabric because it can be very easily woven together, where silks and satins are much more expensive because of the source and the time constraints of making them. What makes clothing in the modern world so expensive is brand recognition. Brand names are a big deal because certain names carry a certain level of importance. For example, I'm wearing a $35 pair of Skechers right now, bought more than a year and a half ago at Costco. A brand new pair of Jordans costs around $180, and that's just on the low end. So, writing tip number 3. Pay attention to the types of clothing worn by your characters based on their economic status and where the characters live. If you're writing a story based on medieval Europe, you may have various cobblers, or shoemakers, not desserts, competing in a village, town, or city for their clientele, but the chances of having a commoner being able to afford a brand new pair of boots every other year would be absurdly unrealistic. Most shoes in that time period would be expensive and were usually kept or modified to last longer on an as-needed basis. Again, clothing choices are often a reflection of how your characters view their wealth and their affluence in the world in which they inhabit. Also, pay attention to the region in which clothing is worn. In Avatar, Katara's and Sokka's clothing adapts to the seasons changing to the point where they have completely ditched their hooded parkas for clothing more appropriate for warmer climates. By the time they get to the edges of the Fire Nation, they're not even wearing Water Tribe clothing and have stolen Fire Nation style clothes to blend in. And while cartoons often depict characters literally wearing the same outfit over and over and over, it makes sense in Avatar given its medieval setting and the fact that most people didn't have 5 or 6 changes of clothes like we do now. But let's talk about style by diversity. This is where you have characters who dress differently based on gender, cultural groups, or, and this is more specific for fantasy and sci-fi, species. Again, this is something Avatar does well. You see gender-specific clothes, dresses and gowns for the women, and usually shirts, tunics, and pants for the men. Interestingly enough, Katara and Azula both wear pants of some kind throughout most of the series. Katara's pants are often hidden under warmer layers of her traditional clothing, whereas Azula wears what looks like some kind of military uniform. What's interesting is that as the series progresses, we see Katara wear more flowing skirts and fabrics that offer her respite from the summer heat and allow her to move more fluidly in her waterbending. The designs are much more feminine, but she has embraced that protective maternal role on Team Avatar. Azula is only seen wearing a dress a handful of times, and either to disguise herself or to be more relaxed, like at the Ember Island party she attends. Most of her clothing is designed to be commanding and masculine. She's at least 14 or 15 years old, trying to act like some supreme commander, and she dominates and terrifies all who encounter her. Her usual attire is restricting and reflects her pent-up insecurities. The only characters who are balanced in this regard are Toph and Suki. In Season 1, Sokka realizes that he had difficulty seeing Suki as a warrior because she's a girl. She says that she's a warrior and she's a girl, reminding him the two aren't mutually exclusive. Toph is seen in the show wearing both dresses and tunics and pants. She actually prefers the latter because she's a scrappy fighter at heart. She is a character who knows how to employ the niceties of culture and to wear what's appropriate when needed, but she chooses, and that's the key word there, she chooses to dress as she does out of comfort because it helps her with her earthbending. If you're writing something with non-human characters in mind, take their physiology into consideration as well. Star Wars does this well enough as the Jedi incorporate some variation to their members' robes based on their cultural origins. Jedi Master Luminara Unduli was allowed to wear her Mirialan headdress as part of her people's heritage. Just the same, Shakti and Ahsoka Tano were Togruta and were allowed to keep their Akul tooth headdress, which was part of their culture. Jumping IPs to Star Trek shows several species who were allowed to modify or incorporate cultural elements into their Starfleet uniform, especially from the TNG era moving forward. Worf, for example, wore his Klingon warrior sash over his uniform, and there were at least 1 or 2 Enterprise crew members who at some point didn't even wear shoes. Here's writing tip number 4. Make appropriate accommodations for your characters based on their gender, culture, and species. This helps flesh out the characters' individual identities within the world and explains how the world at large incorporates these characters and their backgrounds into the tangible reality that you are building for your readers. If it makes sense within the world that you build, it will make sense to your readers too. So that's it. Those are the 4 writing tips for this month's Creators Corner segment. Tip number 1. Put together a timeline of events for your story so that you can see exactly what the causes and their effects are on the events and the characters in your story. Tip number 2. Determine in advance how the leaders in your series both influence and are influenced by culture. Tip 3. Pay attention to the types of clothing worn by your characters based on their economic status and where the characters live. And lastly, tip number 4. Make appropriate accommodations for your characters based on their gender, culture, and species. Hey, thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on new videos. You can support the channel on Patreon and the merch store. Those links can be found down in the video description. Make sure to tune in next week for the January live stream only on Instagram. I'll see you then.